The passages in the book of Acts are most inspiring to me because they talk about how the followers of Christ lived just after he ascended, well before it was even called Christianity. In fact, it was called the Way originally, as in I am the way, the truth, and the life. Acts 2, verses 43 to 47 begin the description of how early Christians lived in community. Awe came upon everyone because many wonders and signs were being done by the apostles. All who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. Day by day, as they spent much time together in the temple, they broke bread from home and ate their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having the goodwill of all people. And day by day, the Lord added to their number those who were being saved. Words inspired by God. Namaste, everybody. It's good to be with you. I'm calling this part of the liturgy or this presentation the soul's graduation. And I'd like to begin with a short 2-minute video by Barbara Carnes. She's a respected hospice RN with years of experience who has written and published a lot about this subject. She calls this video you're about to watch her favorite moment before death story.
I took care of a 4-year-old. I had taken care of his mother when she died 2 years earlier. And this little guy, in the weeks before he died, he told everyone that he was going to take a trip. He actually started collecting money from people for his trip. This was in the weeks before death. And he said to his grandma, "I can't live with you anymore. I'm going to go live with my parents." Both of his parents had already died. In the minutes to hours before death, we held him. We were in a little bedroom and Grandma was in the rocking chair and she'd hold him and rock him back and forth. And he's just lying there with his mouth partially open and his eyes partially open. And all of a sudden, he turned and he opened his eyes wide and he raised his hand and he pointed to the upper corner of that little bedroom and he called Mom by name. And he stayed focused on that corner until he took his last breath. That story is so special to me because that convinced me that Mom was there. I don't think we die alone. I think our loved ones come to be with us, to help us get from this world to the next. And Mom was there to welcome him back into her existence, into her being.
I played that first because I think that when many people think about death, their primary fear is the loss of community. Family, friends, village, city, state, country, favorite places, the beauty of nature, everything that we have constructed as our reality within the boundaries of the temporal space-time illusion. As Sean has pointed out, God fractalized or splintered into us and all living creation in order to experience being through us. Thus, we could say that God's first act or emanation was the formation of community. We know that our sense perceptions are limited, and through NDEs, mirror and water gazing, psychedelic and LBL experiences, legitimate psychic channelings, dreams, and the many reports of masters, we know that community exists on many different planes and with many different beings. This little boy recognized community beyond the physical. How could God create community to experience being through us and then remove it from us, leaving us alone and in the dark after our bodies die? We do not lose community when we pass. We go deeper into a much larger community. Now I'd like to speak about how we can stay in our more temporally defined community as we move from independence to dependence to end of life. Those passages were inspiring because they talked about how community first started after Christ ascended. The words commune, communion, community, communicate all come from the similar root word in Latin, communis, which means common and to share. Christ shared his entire being and the Spirit of God with us while in a body, then through his death and resurrection. In the sacrament of the Eucharist at the Last Supper, he shared his body and blood with us as an invitation to Godhood, the ultimate communion. All spiritual masters and adepts, regardless of cosmology, live in a similar fashion. They give themselves, their love, and their lives freely to everyone. That's one of the many reasons we all love Sean so much. Today, the word community has been diluted, depersonalized, and trivialized to mean anywhere people live in close proximity to each other. The phrase, "it takes a village to raise a child," comes from an African proverb and conveys the message that it takes many people, the village, to share in the provision of a safe, healthy environment for children, where children are given the security they need to develop and flourish, and to be able to realize their hopes and dreams. All of these villagers may provide direct care to the children and support the parent in looking after the children. Now let's revise that passage and update it. The phrase, "it takes a village to rebirth the elder," conveys the message that it takes many people, the village, to provide a safe, healthy environment for elders, where they are given the security and support they need for their souls to transition out of the body without fear. All these villagers may provide direct care to the elder and or support the family in looking after their elders. Unfortunately, whether for the child or the elder, that village in many countries today is dissipated and fragmented. Individuals are increasingly isolated and are not eager to ask for or to provide help to others. Family breakdown, economic pressures, long working hours, cultural emphasis on independence, and increased mobility all have contributed to families feeling less connected to extended family and others around them. About 30 years ago, a transformational experience helped me to develop my personal cosmology regarding end of life. My wife, Ellen, and I volunteered at an adult daycare center for advanced Alzheimer's patients in Kona, Hawaii. I thought I was doing this to give, but I received so much more. I cared regularly for a 92-year-old woman named Dixie, who was an incoherent and constant babbler who had lost all sense of self. The disease had taken away her personality, her individual identity, and verbal communication. I noticed that the disease had dissolved the self-identity of the ego mind for all the clients. They were like helpless, innocent, pre-verbal children. Remembering skills I had learned in neurolinguistic programming, I established rapport with Dixie by sitting in front of her, making eye contact, and responding to her lovingly as if I understood her, using my body language and a soothing voice tone. She would babble, I would read her body and voice tone, sense positivity or negativity, and in her attempt to communicate, and would respond with, "Oh, that sounds interesting, Dixie. How did you feel about that?" Or, "Then what happened, Dixie?" Or, "Oh, you sound very upset, Dixie. I'd like to help you to feel better. Can you tell me more about what's bothering you?" Eventually, she allowed me to hold her hands while we talked, quote unquote talked. And as her agitation diminished, one time she even kissed me on the cheek. As someone who was used to thinking, and to some extent still is used to thinking, that intellect and feelings expressed through word content are the essence of good communication and close relationships, my intense focus on Dixie's body language and voice tone had the unexpected effect of making me completely present, something I had only experienced in meditation before that. I had stopped thinking. One day while driving home, I started thinking about what I had to do next, and that mental shift in focus startled me into recognizing that I had not thought about myself once during the last 4 hours. Immediately, Christ's message popped into my mind. He who would save his life must first lose it. I had lost myself, or transcended it, by being completely present for Dixie. Then one day, as Dixie awoke from a nap, I peeked around the curtain and saw that she was not asleep, yet remained silent for about 5 minutes as I quietly watched. It looked as if she were staring intently through the ceiling of the room and deep into space, with a serene expression and a smile of contentment on her face. Very unusual, since she was always agitated and babbling during each waking moment. I knew I'd seen the expression before, but I couldn't place it. I thought about it a lot over the next few days until I attended the baptism of a newborn. There I saw the exact same expression, as if the baby were looking directly into the face of God. Christ's phrase, "Not until you become as children shall you enter the kingdom of heaven," immediately came to mind. The disease had forced Dixie's regression through life to early childhood, the dissolution of her ego mind, including the dissociation from or transcendence of the individuated self. So Dixie, God bless her soul, had given me the greatest gift ever. She had helped me to discover that by giving ourselves to others, we too transcend the ego mind. We become Christ for that person, and they become Christ to us. The most sacred communion possible. I try to remember this as I do my death doula volunteering. I chuckle now when I look back at how hard I had pondered and searched for years to figure out what my purpose on earth was. It's so simple. We're here for the other. We're here for communion. We each have different gifts by which we help the other, but our purpose is the same. It's why Christ was here, and he asked us to follow him. I now wonder how important independence really is, or should be, and whether or not we allow the pursuit of it to separate us from Christ and the other. Most of us fear the progression of death and our progression to death and our soul separation from our spacesuits, because as that transition occurs, we lose our sense of self in time and space. Many pray for a quick and easy death. I sometimes wonder if Christianity would even exist if that were what Christ had prayed for. I used to jokingly tell friends that if I were told I had a terminal illness and was going to die slowly, I would put on a brown onesie, strap a set of deer antlers to my head, drink a fifth of bourbon, and go staggering through the forest on the first day of deer hunting season. That way, as a Catholic, it wouldn't really be suicide, so I could still go to heaven, and I would avoid the suffering of a slow death. Death, to me, was something to be ignored, not planned for, respected, and valued. I don't feel that way anymore. I now think of death as a sacrament, like a graduation ceremony for the soul, and one for which we should be grateful and most present. And today, with medicine, there should be no physical suffering in death whatsoever. People handle the physical progression to death in many different ways. The challenge is the dependence stage due to all the physical and possibly even financial assistance required before the elder is in the end of life stage, which is generally the last 2 to 4 months of life in the body. After years of priding ourselves on our independence, we might feel weak, useless, or less than if we must depend upon others for help. Psychologists tell us that the 3 most emotionally traumatic events in life are 1, the death of a close loved one, 2, divorce, and 3, moving. In each of these instances, and then in death, there is a radical change in our relationship to others and community. Thus, the death of a life partner, divorced from a community via downsizing, relocation, and moving, can become the trauma trifecta for the elderly. And for those with dementia, these events only add to their confusion. The institutional model that handles independent, dependent, and end-of-life care all in one place is called assisted living. There is another model, which is the nursing home model, where just dependent and end-of-life care are taken care of. One is paid for by Medicare, independent living is not, assisted living is not. And even the nursing home living is only partially paid for by Medicare and can be quite expensive. These generally require only one move, but they do involve the establishment of a new community. Some have found that this meets all of their needs and feel comfortable being with others their own age. Assisted living is institutionally controlled and management is concerned with the bottom line financially. Decision-making is non-communal, and all support for dependents and end of life comes from paid staff, and occasionally by efforts volunteered or shared with family by fellow community members. 800,000 seniors in the US, or just 2% of those over the age of 65, live in assisted living, primarily because only 80% of the elderly can afford it. Staffing decisions in these facilities are usually based upon a financial ratio of support staff to number of residents, just as nursing staff is determined in a hospital. That limits the amount of time that can be devoted to each resident, simply to be present and to listen. Thus, while physical needs may be taken care of in assisted living and bonds with people of similar age may be formed, the village may still have to come to the resident during the dependent and end-of-life stages to provide spiritual and emotional support. Those of us who now live independently in the same town or city where our children and or siblings live may have the best of all worlds. Though a downsizing move may be made to live with family, the community stays intact. And another alternative for those who can afford it is to stay in their homes and pay people to take care of them during their dependent and end-of-life stages with volunteer support from family and friends. There are always physical and mental circumstances that may require an assisted living arrangement when there aren't enough loving community volunteers to support an elder's transition from independence to end of life. And without enough support, even the most loving family members can suffer caregiver burnout. At the Center for Conscious Living and Dying, which I'll discuss shortly, there are 2 doulas on every 5-hour turn, 24/7, taking care of 2 or 3 residents. This can be a great help to family caregivers. So the question is, might there be a more spiritual and communal way to recreate the village of old, where the elders were revered, their knowledge and wisdom was sought, and they were nurtured and cared for by everyone as they entered the dependent and end-of-life stages? Remember the town square and small villages where activities were multi-generational and neighbors took care of each other's children and the elderly? Now I'd like to look at a couple of intentional communities that are trying to recreate a version of this. The first is a 29-unit co-housing community in the Appalachian Mountains of Western Virginia with 40 members and a spiritual and environmental mission. Members must be over the age of 55 and willing to contribute 10 hours a week to the community. The average age is now in the low 70s, and not everyone can contribute as they used to. It was founded by nuns nearly 18 years ago who left their order to be independent of the direction and opinions expressed by the male hierarchy of the church. I see them as religious feminists, kind of like Dorothy Day or Sister Joan Chittister. 4 still live in this community. Catholic orders generally take vows of poverty and share things in common, as the Acts passage suggested. They lovingly care for their own through death. So the nuns who started this community probably expected to die there. And in keeping with their desire to help the poor, some of the units were developed as low-income apartments with a HUD loan. Others are condos. Over the years, members have aged, voluntarily moved to assisted living or to live with family, and new members have arrived, some of whom do not share the original spiritual and environmental mission, some of whom were simply looking for an inexpensive place to live, and some of whom were close to becoming dependent. Some who are able to participate in community activities do not. Because they didn't plan for waning participation or residents' dependent stage of life, they are now being forced to do so. Given the loving nature of most residents, the desire to remain in community, and their knowledge that they too could eventually need the same kind of assistance, these challenges may really be a blessing in disguise. One option that has come up in their strategic planning is the acquisition of property in the adjacent residential neighborhood for conversion into a group home for dependent and end-of-life care. That way the residents can stay bonded and visit those who require more assistance. I hope to help them with their evolution in this regard. The Center for Conscious Living and Dying was established by a palliative care physician, 3 other women, many volunteers, and several retired hospice RNs. It was aided by an angel benefactor who purchased a small farm for the operation. Its purpose is to provide compassionate and attentive spiritual, emotional, and physical support for the dying and their visiting families in a residential setting. It is a nonprofit and a member of the Omega Home of group homes, Omega Network of group homes. Residents stay for free, must have a 2-month prognosis, and qualify for hospice to become residents. Hospice provides any on-site medical care that is required. They have 3 Airbnb rooms that can be used by visiting family and 3 rooms for residents who are dying. The Lighthouse is a separate building used for meetings, trainings, and meditations. They have a very large solar array and a teepee covering a fire that is kept burning 24/7 for those in the last stage of life. Doulas and family can meditate by the fire, residents too, if they are physically able. The rural setting is beautiful, peaceful, and the renovated farmhouse, now called the Sanctuary, has incredible views of the mountains. In 1 year, 250 volunteers have joined CCLD, and they've all been trained by the 4 full-time directors. Some take care of grounds, some train volunteers, others take care of the kitchen and clean rooms, some manage events, some clean, some shop, some coordinate volunteers, events, and publicity. Some are fire keepers and actually sleep by the fire to keep it burning as long as the resident lives. Others help with fundraising and administration. Many are death doulas, which is what I was trained to do by CCLD. Of that 250 volunteers, I would guess that 40% are over the age of 65. And of that group, roughly 50% have lost life partners recently. During our months of training and internship, we all fell in love with each other. You can't sit in a dyad and be totally present with someone sharing their grief and not fall in love with them, and they with you when it's your turn. We have cried and laughed together, and every volunteer with whom I've spoken says that CCLD is where they want to die, God willing, and when it's time. CCLD is full of loving, well-trained, compassionate volunteers who see taking care of others not as an obligation, not as something to be paid for, not as a sacrifice of free time, but as a blessing and part of life's mission. Many would love living in a place where they can take care of their friends when they become dependent, just as they would like to be taken care of. So CCLD has a common core value affinity that has eroded by neglect over the years at the first community I mentioned. In CCLD's long-term strategic plan, they hope to move from an excellent one-of-a-kind end-of-life care operation to possibly including independent and dependent living. And they have a built-in market of volunteers as potential residents who can also compassionately help those among them who become dependent before they require end-of-life care. Both organizations hope to end up in the same place, which would be a smaller, volunteer-based co-housing community with core spiritual and environmental values, the old village version of the institutional assisted living model. The key to the success of both organizations is in aligning with and attracting people as volunteers and residents who believe in and wish to create the type of community described in the Book of Acts. A return to the village that cares for everyone and the environment with a spiritual communal intent may take us back to the future, dignifying, even celebrating end of life instead of dreading it. It could cherish elders and honor the end of life process instead of isolating those who are progressing toward the soul's separation from the body. Maybe we can expand and grow spiritually in that type of community while helping others to do the same, even as our bodies slow down and require more assistance. The root words for companion in Latin are com, meaning with and to share, and panis, which means bread. So it literally means to share bread with one another. Fellow believers in the Acts passages broke bread together and shared everything in common. It is not simply a ritual in church each Sunday. It is living the sacrament of communion in our daily lives. Perhaps we're being recalled to expand out of the body while in a loving community. Maybe using our money to express our independence until our last breath isn't the end-of-life celebration for which we should be preparing. Is alleviating the need for care from communities and families by paying strangers to care for us the best solution? Maybe there is a way that we can be companions on the journey until together we celebrate the advancement of our souls into the next phase of life. Now I'd like to show you another trailer from Barbara Carnes. It's called The New Rules for End-of-Life Care. It's a short one. Barbara is an experienced hospice nurse, as I said. The full video is a practical, useful, and very educational explanation of what happens physically and mentally during the process of leaving our bodies. It's certain that each of us will go through this process someday, and we all will help our loved ones to do the same. So why not be prepared for it? The full video is about 20 minutes long and can be purchased on our website and comes with 2 booklets for $29.
Dying is not a medical event. Dying is a social, communal event. And when we're at the bedside of someone who's dying, it is all about the community, about the togetherness, not about the medical stuff that's going on. But families don't know that. There are new rules for end-of-life care. Taking care of someone in the last months of their life is not like taking care of someone who's going to get better. But most people don't know this. And so my job is to help families understand the new rules. The normal, natural way that a person dies has a process. And that process involves 3 things: eating, sleeping, and withdrawing from the world around them. The hardest thing for me to get people to understand is that when a person has entered the dying process, it's okay not to eat. Food is what holds us in our body. Food is the anchor that holds us, that gives us grounding. And if the body's preparing to die, it doesn't want the food or the grounding it's trying to let go. Dying is not painful. Dying does not cause pain. Disease causes pain. So you're going to look at a person's disease history to understand end-of-life pain. We watchers of the dying process are identifying it as it looks painful. Dying itself is not. The person's so removed from their physical body that they don't experience it in the same way that we who have a firm grip on this planet feel it. If pain has been a part of the disease process, and there's a lot of disease out there that has pain, then you are going to treat that pain until the person's last breath. There is no reason today for any person to die in pain. And if someone says to me, we've done everything we can and this person is still in pain, then my answer is, you have not done everything. What we want to give to that person who's leaving us is our presence, is our love, our care and our concern. And it isn't necessarily the words that we say. It's our being there. The person who's dying, they're reaching a point where words really don't mean anything. It's that you're there. It's the touch, the holding. It's okay to get in bed with your loved one. It's okay to have the dog on the bed. It is that communal companionship, that presence that means more than anything else in the days to hours to even months before death.
So, doulas, families, and the residents going through end of life in the body, each have their own cosmologies. With others at CCLD, I've assisted Buddhists, Christians, atheists, and agnostics in their transitions. We don't share our cosmologies with the residents or their families unless they ask to speak about it. Our job is to be a loving presence, not educators or evangelists. Words mean much less at this stage of life anyway. I'm still not comfortable calling myself a death doula. My discomfort has nothing to do with fear. It's because death is a very highly charged word and it's limited to the physical. And there is so much more and unseen what's going on. For me, I have noticed that due to the fatigue caused by organs naturally shutting down, as well as the heavy opiates used to eliminate the pain of disease, a person moves from being communicative to non-communicative with their body and mind, usually 1 to 2 weeks prior to physical death. If disease and drugs are not involved, they may remain cognizant till very close to their passing, as my wife did. But that is rare. As the resident progresses towards physical death, I tend to separate their body and mind from their spirit, just as they are doing. Elvis, in this case, the spirit, is leaving the building, in this case, the body and mind, as Barbara Carnes pointed out. During those last days or weeks, their consciousness is outside of the body, though still attached to it. The time-space illusion that they are their body and mind is collapsing, and so it must collapse for me. And their spirit or soul holds lightly onto the doorknob from the outside as the body ceases to function. However, their consciousness is not diminished in the least. I realized this personally when I came very close to death from cancer 7 years ago. Sean mentioned the Buddhist meditation practice called Tonglen, whereby the meditator breathes in the pain and anguish of the experiencer, whether that be oneself, the one who is dying, or their family. This is the opposite of our instinctual habit to avoid pain and seek pleasure. It builds compassion, healing the receiver and the sender. The word compassion in its Latin root words, com meaning with and pati meaning to suffer, literally means to suffer with. And we are neurologically constructed with mirror neurons that make compassion a natural response. Then that pain from the in-breath is converted into love in the heart and sent out on the out-breath to those experiencing the pain. Having been present for the physical decline and ultimate passing of my soulmate, I have experienced putting on a can-do, happy, everything will be all right face for my loved one, while feeling intense fear of loss, but trying to hide it. So I easily recognize this state in the family of loved ones who are dying, and I have started using Tonglen as my breath prayer for them when they are present. We doulas listen and laugh with families, reminiscing in the living room. We walk residents in wheelchairs on the grounds. 2 months ago, from the back porch, we watched a mother black bear playing with her 2 cubs near the bee boxes on the farm. We take residents and their families to the fire, where we are all transported to another place while staring into the flames. I once spent an hour and a half with the barefooted 5-year-old granddaughter of one resident. She sat on my lap and showed me the exact spot on the bottom of her foot where she'd been stung by a bee the year before. Then we made slippers out of Kleenex and Scotch tape. We weren't going for durability. It was just the fun of playing together. That's community. But when I'm alone with a spirit whose body is dying and who is, for most part, unconscious, I'm sharing my love with that exiting spirit. I dissociate from the physical image and non-functioning mind before me, and I consciously associate with their spirit. I try to adopt observer consciousness, a state beyond mind and thought. Their body is merely the mortal coil that their eternal soul is shedding. So our relationship becomes one without words, much like my relationship was with Dixie. I may hold their hand or place mine gently over their heart, feeling the warmth and the pulse of their blood, but it's less about the physical contact and more of a silent, shared meditation where presence and love is all that we can be to one another. And it feels like the sacred grace of communion to me. I see their spirit, that holographic fractal of God, as Sean calls it, freeing itself from the body. It is everlasting and has many journeys ahead. It is leaving to join a larger community of free spirits and higher beings. It made the free will choice to incarnate and is now making the free will choice to disincarnate. Their consciousness is melding with universal consciousness and returning to the whole, perhaps more fully identifying with the whole than it ever did when the ego, mind, and body were healthy and active filters. And the whole is always greater than the sum of its parts. Therein lies the mystery, and it's awe-inspiring. What transcendent joy might that soul be experiencing in the fuller recognition of our true home, I wonder? As that little boy in the first video recognized his mother. And I also wonder how we can call this graduation and homecoming a death. I'd like to end with a quote from Alan Watts, the great American Zen Buddhist, who said, quote, "What I am proposing is the transformation of everyday consciousness into a new kind of knowing. The knowing that what is going on outside of you is all one process with what is going on inside of you, and that you are all that there is. We are unaware of what our real soul is. Therefore, we get anxious. We fear that death may be the end of us, and that somehow we shall just pass out of this world altogether, and that will be that. This, of course, is the purest superstition, because everyone is, in fact, indestructible. We perceive ourselves through our senses as individual organisms that come and go like the leaves on a tree. But the tree remains, and we are the tree. The Bible says, before Abraham was, I am. That I am is us, what the Hindus call Brahman and the Chinese call the Tao. We are eternal. Namaste, and thanks for listening.
Oh, wow, Tom. Thank you for a tremendous program today. You really brought us right into that sacred space of life and death. And I just really appreciate all the experience, strength, and hope you've shared with us. So thank you for your service, and thank you for all that you are, and many blessings to continue with what you're doing. One question I have, Tom, right at the beginning, you had some letters that you mentioned, like, was it DD, DT,
LD something, LDL,
L,
LDL, or
wasn't
Oh,
sure.
the LBL, Life Between Lives.
life
Oh,
between
okay,
lives.
okay. I didn't catch
That
that.
hypnotherapeutic regression that Sean went through and did
Oh,
talked
okay,
about
got it.
at the retreat.
Okay.
Meet many beings in between lives.
Oh, yeah.
Great. So thank you for your personal sharing again. Just
Sure.
so much gratitude for you and what you're doing. So
Oh,
thank
thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I've had the privilege over the many years. I'm a nurse, but it wasn't just nursing because it was actually personal family members that I had the privilege of being present as someone passed into their next phase. And I love the Center for Conscious Living that you are speaking about. Are there others of them around the country? Are there very many of these?
There is a group called, I think I mentioned it, the Omega Network. And, Omega meaning the last, the Alpha and Omega. And they have group homes in many cities across the United States. And that's a residential setting in which people can die, and there is no charge. So there may actually be some in the area where you're located, where you could volunteer if you wanted to. That the volunteering is the only people who come as untrained volunteers to the Center for Conscious Living and Dying are family members and friends who want to be with the loved one who is passing. Everyone else is either trained as a death doula, and even if they're a retired hospice nurse, they still receive the training for the death doula work because it's more of a spiritual and emotional training that it is a physical one. There's very little aside from changing people and washing them and taking care of personal hygiene and all of that sort of stuff. There's really not much in the way of medical attention that they require. So hospice prescribes and delivers all the medications which we administer, but it's rare that a hospice doctor or nurse is there from hospice unless there's some challenge regarding shifts in medication or some behavior on the part of the patient that needs to be addressed by a professional.
Mm-hmm. So I could check out Omega Network.
I'd Google the Omega Network, and that's the national organization, and they probably have some place where you can put in a town or a city and see if there's an Omega home in that vicinity near where you live. CCLD is a member of that network, and they got some of their ideas and information about how to develop their facility from the Omega Network.
I had the honor 10 years ago of assisting my brother who was in hospice for about a week before he was dying. And he was in hospice, but I really didn't know much about hospice. Like you said, they really only come to deliver medications or to perhaps help if some sort of behavior is going on with the patient. And it was my perception, and I'm a nurse practitioner, but I'm not in that, the hospice world, but it was my perception that they were there a whole lot more. So I believe I acted as my brother's death doula. I didn't, it took me like an entire weekend and to read the book that they left us to understand how to function for him at that time. And, I was his advocate because he was experiencing a lot of pain, and I insisted that they put some sort of continuous infusion of pain medication into him. But it's just so important for this message to get out there, because I know that a lot of people don't understand the role of hospice and how to actually be a supportive death doula, if you will, for your family members.
Yeah, I agree. I think the education is the important part of that. That's why I would highly recommend purchasing that full video from Barbara Carnes, as well as the couple of pamphlets that come with it, because it covers a lot of this stuff. I was my wife's death doula at home, and we did use hospice, and hospice, extremely compassionate and loving people, very caring and available, on call 24 hours,
Yep.
but not actually physically present
Right.
for much of the time. And that's because it's covered by Medicare, that's a function of insurance reimbursement, I think. And then on the spiritual side, they will offer, you will generally be called by a pastor or a minister from the local area and asked if you would like to have him come and visit and speak with the person who is dying.
Right.
And that can happen on a, once a week basis, or 3, 4, 5 times a week. I'm not sure how often they are able to come. But that's the way it's handled when the death is handled at home. But the person who's the caregiver, especially if they have all of the emotional stress that they're going through with the loss of a loved one, really could use an education, because the tendency is to treat the person who's dying as someone who might get better. I remember bugging my wife to drink more, stay hydrated, and you got to eat something. You got to have protein, blah, blah, blah. Wrong thing to do. She didn't
Right.
need it. She didn't want it.
Exactly. Exactly.
I was thinking that was the right thing to be telling her to do, and it was exactly the wrong thing to be telling her to do. And in fact, there's an entire book written called Voluntary Stopping. It's either stopping or cessation, voluntary cessation of eating and drinking. The acronym is VSED. And about 80% of the patients, residents that I take care of, choose that when they come to stay at CCLD. And so they voluntarily stop drinking and eating. And if you do that, you will pass in a couple of weeks. And if these people are going to be unconscious most of the time anyway, due to the heavy opiates that they're taking because of the pain that they're in,
Right.
they decide, well, why not leave earlier? And some of them, while they're conscious, will actually do things like we'll order a cheeseburger for them, and they just want the taste of a cheeseburger, and they'll take a big bite and chew it up and then spit it out just so they can taste what a cheeseburger tastes like. Or we had one resident that really loved coconut ice cream, so every day or so we'd give her a spoonful of coconut ice cream just so that she could experience the flavor of it. But the more you eat and drink, the longer your body's going to be around.
Absolutely.
There's no doubt about it.
Yeah. Well, I thank you for this, Tom. I give you a lot of respect for the work that you're doing. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. I'm glad to spread the word. I've learned a lot from it that I wish I knew while I was helping my wife to transition, and so I'm happy to pass it on to others now.
I too have been present in the transition of a dear loved one, and I also received an awful lot from that myself, participating in that process. You had mentioned that you received so much, and if you're willing, if you could expand on the blessings that have come to you through this process of being the giver to others at the end of life.
Well, we have when doulas change turns, we call the people who are staying with us residents, not patients. We're intentionally trying to get away from the medical paradigm. So we call them patients, and we do not call the turns that we do shifts. We say that we're taking turns. And when we change turns with another doula team, and 2 are leaving and 2 are coming, we have about a 15-minute transfer process, which we call a transfer of trust. And we first meditate together for about 5 minutes. And then they share everything that's happened during their turn, including changes in medication or behaviors the resident had, or people who visited them, whatever. And then they leave and we take over. But the first thing we do when we sit down is we each go around the room and we say, just describe where you are right now with 1 word. And the word that comes out of me almost every time is love, because when I come down the steps to the sanctuary and go into that space, that's all that everybody that's there is gathered for, right? Just to love that resident to death. You're loving someone to death is basically what you're doing when you're there. And you feel that, our purpose is 100% aligned. We're all there for exactly the same reason. And so you just automatically slip into sort of a meditative state. And while half of your 5-hour shift might be, cleaning toilets or changing bedding or doing something else physical, getting food or whatever. I've even run out to pharmacies for salves and things like that while I've been there. A good 2.5 hours of the time is spent with the residents. And that is a deep meditation as far as I'm concerned. I've had deeper meditations when with the residents than I've had on my own sitting at home. The distractions, the mental thoughts, the things that can creep into your meditation seem to be much fewer in that setting. So that's the gift that I've received. I've never done a 2.5 hour meditation before, and I've never fallen in love, deep love, with so many different people who are passing. And if their families are there, it's the exact same thing. Everybody in the family, and they may be from all over the United States and haven't seen each other for a while. They may have completely different cosmologies and ideas about religion and death and everything else, but they're all 100% there to be in love with that person who is passing. And so it's an extremely unifying love energy that you experience in that kind of setting. And I always leave feeling like I've been in deep meditation for about 5 hours, and in love with everybody that I've been in connection with. So it's a very rare experience, and quite a wonderful one. So you feel uncomfortable being thanked for it because you're getting so much more than you're giving. At least I do.
Thank you very much, Tom. I appreciate you articulating that. 30 years ago, the 4th of this month, a dear lady friend of mine who I met with breast cancer passed, and I was with her and her family. And it was it is probably the most moving experience that I've ever been part of. So I can appreciate the moccasins in which you walk in daily, and the love that you bring to others. And thank you for enlightening us in that whole process. I greatly appreciate you and value you to bring this to all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And the training was very important, and that because you have to let go of your own shit, excuse the word, in order to be completely present and not in fear or concern, and in complete calm and presence for someone else. And the families are typically the ones who have a lot of that fear and concern because they obviously haven't been trained on how to go through this. So helping them to be calm. I mean, if you spend your entire turn just talking to family members about what they're going through, and the other doula completely takes care of the resident or residents while you're doing that, you're doing just as much good work as you would be if you were sitting with the resident. So it was really helpful, and I was very surprised when I went through the training because I thought I was going to be taught how to take care of somebody, and I was taught how to unload all of my stuff, my fears and my apprehensions and my misgivings, in order to be present for somebody. So it was much more about changing me from the inside out than it was about figuring out how to, change bedpans or that kind of stuff. So it was a great training from that respect also. So I still feel like I got more than I'm getting more than I give.
I want to say you're an angel walking among us. And being a birth doula and the death doula, they're actually kind of almost the same thing. But and I have been around 4 people and 3 dogs, not necessarily exact at the moment of all of their passing. But I have a question for you about when a family is trying to make a decision about the end of life of somebody. Are you there with them as well? I mean, I had to make decisions about if we were going to give my father more liquid, it would have killed him faster. And then also, things like that I kind of lie awake at night and still think about. But do you help the family through that as well? Or is the patient ever involved in those decisions?
Usually there's at least one nurse on the team when we're taking care of others, either present or upstairs or available by phone. We do have lead doulas, and we do have RNs who are kind of in charge of the medical side of things. So if there's any change in treatment that has to happen, it's usually discussed between the family and one of the directors, along with the people from hospice, and all the pros and cons are considered, and then a decision is made. I haven't experienced much of that having to happen because when people come to CCLD, they already have a 2-month prognosis, and there are a lot of intake forms that have to be filled out, about their religious preference and food preferences and who can visit and who can't and all of that sort of stuff. And so they're really the only time that you might get into a conflict. Usually they've given their power of attorney to their family, to someone in their family. And so when the patient becomes unconscious and can't speak for themselves anymore, and if there's a change to be made in their care, then it has to be approved by the family member. And there are occasions where the resident themselves might have wanted it to be done a little differently, but the family's then in charge and they're making the decisions, and we either take our directions directly from the resident if they're conscious and able to speak for themselves, or from the family if they aren't. So we never do anything without their permission. And we're sometimes in a position where we have to explain the pros and cons of doing or not doing something.
Right.
This issue related to voluntarily stopping eating and drinking comes up a lot. Some people choose it, then change their minds. Some people choose it and stick with it. Some people never choose it. We had a woman who was with a endometrial cancer and a vaginal fistula, so she was basically pooping through her vagina, and you would have thought that would have been the number one person who would have chosen to stop eating and drinking. But she had a lot of people to see and a lot of people to talk to. People were coming in from around the country. She wanted to maintain consciousness while she did all of that, so she even suffered through some pain because she didn't want to be fuzzy from the pain medicine. And she ate. We had a refrigerator full. She was a Buddhist. We had a refrigerator full of organic stuff, and we were feeding her whatever she wanted all the time. If I'd been in her position, I probably would have stopped eating and drinking a long time before she did.
Never know.
But, it's up to each person's choice.